Now, so far we built a good enough program. It can take user input, and based on it, it changes the MAC address of the interface that the user specifies to the MAC address that they choose. What I don't like about it right now though is it looks a little bit messy, and I think it can really use some refactoring. Therefore, I think this is a great opportunity to introduce you to functions. Now, functions are used everywhere in programming, and we've actually used them in previous lectures even without you thinking. So for example, when we used to use the input or the raw input, that was a function that displays on screen whatever we put in here and returns whatever the user inputs, and then we used to capture that and store it in a variable. So what we mean by a function is it's a set of instructions that carry out a certain task. Like we've seen before, it can take an input. So for example, again here, the input or the raw input takes a string as input and displays it on screen. And it can return a value. And again, we've seen that this returns the value of whatever the person enters using their keyboard. Now, the reason why we use functions is because, first of all, they make our code look pretty, and we'll see that now once we use it. It also makes our code reusable. So we've seen before that we use the input function twice in our code to ask for the interface and for the MAC address. Without that function, we would have had to write the code for the input function twice. It also makes our code or makes programming more abstract because when we use the input, for example, we don't even know how it works. We don't know the code used in this function. All we know is I need to give it a string. The string that I give will be displayed on screen, and then the function will work and ask the user to enter something. Whenever the user enters something, the function will give it back to me. I don't know the code behind the input function itself. Whoever wrote it very well, and now all of us are using it. So you need to use the same idea when you program. So whenever you have a block of code in your program, for example, right here, we have a block of code that changed the MAC address. Now we know that this code works very well, and if we bundle this inside a function, then we can reuse this function any number of times, even in the future if we write bigger programs and need to be able to change the MAC address from within that program, then we can just call this function instead of having to type its code again. Not only that, but we can also bundle this in a separate file, and then we can just import this the same way that we import subprocess right here and call a MAC changer function. So we won't even have to worry about the code written in this function. Maybe in a year or 2 year or 5 year time from now, you want to be able to use a code that changes the MAC address. You won't have to rewrite it. You won't even have to remember how to change the MAC address. All you have to do is just call the function that you created before. So let's try and bundle all of this inside a function and use it from our code. Now, first of all, you can define a function like so. You just have to type def followed by the function name, and it's a good idea to use meaningful function names. So we'll call this function changeMac. Okay. Now, followed by this, you need to put 2 brackets, and between these 2 brackets, we're going to specify the input that this function takes. Again, going back to the input function, this function used to take a string as an input and then do stuff with it and display it on screen, as we know. So when we're defining our function here, we need to specify what inputs it takes. So we know in order to change the MAC address, we need an interface and we need a MAC address. So we're going to call these interface and new MAC. Again, the names here are completely up to you. You can use any name that you find suitable. You can use X and Y if you wanted, as long as they are valid variable names. Once you define the function name and the inputs that it takes, all you have to do is just put colon here at the end of the line and then hit enter. Now you'll see automatically PyCharm has indented this and put a tab for our cursor. This is to show that everything that we're going to write now is going to be part of the changeMac function and is going to be part of this block of code. Now the goal of this function to change the MAC address, and we already know the instructions to change the MAC address. It's these instructions right here. So I'm just going to cut them, Control X, and paste them here. What's very important to note is all of the code that is part of this function need to be indented the same indentation in here. So all of the code that starts in here, this is part of the normal Python program or script. Everything that's indented in here is part of the changeMac function. This is how Python separates blocks of code based on indentation. That's it. Now our function is done. We have a function called changeMac. It takes an interface and a new Mac. And whenever we call this function, it'll execute all the instructions in here. So if we don't call this, nothing is going to happen. Let me show you what I mean. If I go down on my Python program and run the same command that we used to run before, and let's change that to 22 at the end, you can see that we didn't get a print statement. And if I do ifconfig eth0, you'll see that the MAC address did not change. This is because we defined the function here, but we never used it in here. So it's kind of similar to when we import a module but never use it. So now what's happening is whenever you run Python, it's going to read this, read that this is a function, but not execute any of that. And then it'll go back in here and start executing from the parser. It'll read the stuff that the person enters, it'll parse them, it'll get the interface and all of that, but it'll never call changeMac. So all we have to do in here is call changeMac. Now as you can see, PyCharm automatically knows what I need to give to this based on the definition in here. So it's telling me that I need to give it an interface. And we know that the value for the interface is stored in options.interface. So I'm actually going to use this directly and instead of using the interface variable in here. So I'm just going to do options.interface. And for the Mac, we're going to use options.newMac. And I'm going to delete these two lines because we don't need them. They just store the value of options.interface in interface and options.newMac in a newMac. But now I'm using it directly. I'm using options.interface and options.newMac in the changeMac function. So now when Python reaches this line, it's going to read, okay, this is a call for changeMac. I'm going to use the interface as the first input here and use newMac as the second input in here. Call this function, execute all of this code, which will change the MAC address for me. Let's test it out. Going down, run the same exact command that we did before, but it didn't work. Right now, it printed the statement for me, which means that it actually did get into this block of code. And then if we do ifconfig eth0, you'll see that the MAC address did change to the MAC address that I want. Now, as you can see, the code already looks neater. And now, every time I need to change the MAC address, I won't have to use these 4 lines anymore. All I have to do is just call changeMac anywhere I want in my code, give it the interface, give it the new Mac, and it'll change it for me. Not only that, but in the future, you'll learn how to put this in a special file and be able to call it from any Python program that you want. This will allow you to change the MAC address within any program that you write without having to worry about the code used in this function. Something similar to the way that we use input, print, row input, and so on.